Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Nice to be here with you today in worship in the Friends Way. Well, kind of. I don't think the Friends Way ever included computers, but now we have learned a new way. I actually attended a Friends Church for 3 years in North Valley with my good friend Stan. And some of you probably remember Stan. He's passed on, but we went to coffee at least once a month together. So Stan Thornburg. Yeah, so I know last year the theme of Who was hospitality, and that's one that just really strikes a chord with my wife and I, and what we do and what we've been doing most of our lives. Our personal family histories, both our parents were very hospitable. We always had relatives or other people living with us, and we kind of carried that tradition on. And most of what we do here, when people say, well, what's your program at Elahay? It's like kind of like I know they want to know, like we do this, and this, but what we really do is just extend hospitality to people and talk a lot with them. And I think that word shouldn't be underestimated. It's a great way to live your life. And I do a whole lot of speaking about shalom, or what we call our native harmony way. Biblically, it'd be considered the big picture of shalom. And I have what's called a Shalom Sabbath Jubilee construct that I understand is the sort of the mega theme of Scripture, and what Jesus was about. Jesus was, I don't care for the word kingdom particularly, but if you're going to use it, it should be used with the word shalom kingdom. So yeah, and a lot of people don't know American history very well, and it's mostly not their fault, because you're not supposed to really learn it the way it really happened. You're supposed to learn the mythological way. But one of the things that's said by anthropologists and early explorers is that on almost every occasion, not every occasion, but almost every occasion, the native people extended hospitality to their white visitors at first. And there's even a lot of stories about that. And were quite hospitable until they couldn't be anymore because of the abuse of the hospitality. So this is an interesting time to be asked to speak. The first Sunday of the new year. 2021 is here, and I'm still grasping that. And you're probably not going to like me for saying this, but I think 2021 is going to be as bad as 2020. And if you've had other hopes, that's good to have hope, but also be prepared for a different reality. We've got a number of crises facing us. We've talked about them. We've seen them exposed this year. I just wrote down a few here. We have a health crisis that's much bigger than just the pandemic. We have a climate crisis that's probably the most impending disaster waiting to happen on all of us. We have an economic crisis. We have a housing crisis in Portland in particular. We have a racism crisis. And now we have a democracy crisis, a governmental democracy crisis. And I understand those, and I'm going to ask you to think with me here over the next 20, 25 minutes or so, to try and think along with me. I understand that as one crisis, not all the same. They each have their individual aspects, but they all stem from one thing, and that is the way. And again, please try as much as you can to go along with my understanding of what's happening. Is a flawed Western worldview. And so what I'm going to talk about today has to do with understanding life from a different worldview and trying to critique the West just a little bit. And maybe you can give me that 20, 25 minutes to think about this. Jesus in the scripture, which I'll show in just a minute, in Luke 4, basically this is his hometown enunciation of what he was going to be about, of who he was and what his mission on earth would be. And then even in his own hometown, he has to confront them with the way that they view things. They understood what God's purpose on earth was as one thing, and he understood it as something very different. We'll go over that in just a minute, but that's the similarity today to what we're facing. We're facing a crisis of thinking. And I'd like to share with you just a little bit. I'm going to share screen, and it always takes me a little bit because I'm very clumsy at this. But I want to share a screen with you, and let's view this thing. Here we go. Can everyone see that? Okay. So I want us to think about, and we're talking about land and we're talking about race today because that was sort of the theme that came up as Matt and I talked. But and I want to talk about some of the connections there, the intersectionality of this. But if I had to sort of like put today in like, bag it all up and give it a title, I would say that today it's about teaching old dogs new tricks. Trying to teach us maybe a different way of thinking in the world. And so if you think about a place, I want you to think about, as I describe a place, think about where it is, where deforestation is happening, where topsoil is depleted, where the oceans and bays are polluted and fished out, where rivers and streams are undrinkable, where air pollution makes breathing unhealthy, where disease is killing tens of thousands, where large mammals are going extinct, where classism reigns via gender, wealth, race, where cities are overcrowded, where the majority of people are living in poverty, where corruption and greed run rampant and injustice is the norm except for the top 1%, and hunger, disease, war, and economic depression are pretty common. And so as you think about that place, if you were thinking like, Western Europe in the late Middle Ages, most of you probably weren't, right? But if you were thinking that, you would be exactly right. Because all of those things were occurring in Western Europe at the time of quote unquote discovery. At the time when Europeans began to flood into the Americas. This is what was going on. And so in some ways you can't blame people, right? It's like we want to escape all this stuff. We want to and actually have our own land. And so there's plenty of rationale, but people were trying to get away for a reason. And this is the reason. Now, the problem is that now we are experiencing all this 528 years later, all the same things. And the commonality here is the Western worldview. It hasn't changed. And there's some reasons for that I'll go into. But we are living in what right now, like I said, the largest crisis of our time is what they're calling the Anthropocene, which I think is an inadequate word. It sort of places the blame where it doesn't belong. Anthro being man or humans. It is a human-caused crisis. But another person has called it the Eurocene, and I'm going to quote him in just a minute and tell you why, some good rationale, because it was a particular European worldview that brought this to the world. And then I would like to call it actually because it was a particular European male view that brought this crisis to the world. And I call it the Europatricene. And that's the age that I say that we're living in, is the Europatricene. In my view, the 528 years of Western worldview has not done the earth nor the world much good. And each of these pictures has its own history. So Jairus Grove, who's a professor at the University of Hawaii in Manoa, said it was the European elite that developed a distinctively mechanistic view of matter, an oppositional relationship to nature, and an economic system indebted to geographic expansion. That's what we call empire, right? So wealth had to be generated by exploiting people and resources, and that's our key today, people and resources. Understanding the forces of Europeanization, the forces of racial superiority, economic hegemony, and global resettlement is essential to understanding how the planet got to this point. And I believe the reason for this is about 3,000 plus years of thinking in what I would call Platonic dualistic terms. Now, I hope this isn't too highbrow for anybody, but I'm going to, hopefully we'll have some time to break this down. It's really difficult once you've gone that academic route to get that stuff off of you and just talk plain. And so forgive me if I get ahead, but I definitely want to break this down. To be platonically dualistic is to invest in the ethereal or the mental, the spiritual, the metaphysical, the abstract realm to a degree higher than the physical. So all of a sudden, the mental, spiritual, abstract realm takes on a higher importance. Our thoughts, and then you actually subjugate then the physical world as a result, right? It's that old idea of we're so, heavenly minded, we're no earthly good. So our thoughts, our philosophies, our theologies become disembodied. And so it becomes a matter of what we think about God that's really important rather than what we actually do. The physical, the land, the works, our bodies are all suspect in that kind of a worldview and in that kind of a theology. The products of the mind are held higher than personhood and community. Things like laws and documents and doctrines and rules, those all matter more because they're products of the mind. People have gotten together and put their minds together. And that sometimes becomes more important than community and personhood. And then it also creates binary thinking. Things are either right or wrong, legal, illegal, etc. The English language even lends itself to that, so that, even like, we have like weeds and plants. And one of the things we do here at Elahe is we're doing wild tending. So we look for medicine plants, and most of those people would call weeds. But we have this distinction, see, in English, there's weeds and there's plants. There's animals and there's varmints. And it's a worldview that decides. So what constitutes this norm of 528 years, at least America's shores, of Christian white supremacy? Because racism is one of those things that follows when you break things down to where everything has to be hierarchical, where the ethereal is higher than the corporal or the physical, then everything begins to line up in hierarchies. So human beings have to be over nature, men have to be over women, whites have to be over everybody else, etc., etc., etc. And it comes from ancient Greco-Roman civilizations. This is where it's been passed down. And if you don't think that we honor those, just stroll through Washington, D.C. sometime. Because it was just after the Renaissance is when the United States sort of became a nation, and all of that was with the founding fathers. And man, you walk around, you think you're in Greece or Rome or somewhere when you go down to Washington, D.C. They were idealizing that civilization, the great civilization, they would call it. So the doctrines of discovery, that's somehow that got messed up here, but you've probably heard about that and talked about it. Genocide of Native Americans, forced removal, the land theft of Native Americans, attitudes concerning black chattel slavery, laws during Jim Crow era, residual racism in the 20th and 21st centuries, the school to prison pipeline, mascots, characters, cartoons, privilege of indifference. All of these things come out of a Western way of thinking. So how do we have a relationship with the land and a relationship with other people? So first we have to see that there's a corollary. In the Western worldview, the nature of the relationship with the land has changed because we're all indigenous from somewhere. At one time, all of our peoples were indigenous to a particular land, and they knew how to live with that land. But now we're not, and we're not mostly in America because of a Western dualistic worldview. The relationship has changed about farmers and food. Goal is cheap food, profiteering, global distancing, convenience, all of these things. We see things differently. But I want to draw your attention to the correlation between how we think of people and how we think of land, because that's really what we're talking about today. There's a corollary between how European Americans treat creation and how people are treated, especially women. Both are meant to be controlled, both land and women, and people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color. We could add that as well. To objectify both land, to objectify women, to objectify Black, Indigenous people of color, to exploit them all. They all are meant to serve at one's pleasure, to expect production from. And we live in a rape culture of women, of land, and of Black, Indigenous people of color. And what you saw with George Floyd and all the other incidents that happened this year, that's, I would say that's a rape culture. That's saying, that you don't matter enough for me to have the same treatment of you as I do other people who are white. I get this. I'm glad someone mentioned breeding sweetgrass, because I got this from that book. What does it mean? What does land mean? The next couple PowerPoints are directly from that wonderful book. Land could be just a source of ecosystem services. It could be property. It could be natural resources. It could be used as capital. But in an indigenous worldview and in many non-Western worldviews, land is much more. Land is sustainer. Land is a residence for our non-human relatives. Land is our identity. Land is inspirited. Land is home. Land is our ancestral connection. Land is a healer. Land is a source of knowledge. It's sacred. It's a land as a moral responsibility. And so there are lots of people in the world that don't view land as a commodity. But in the Western worldview, this is how we've been taught and forced into understanding land. And as a result, we need to also examine how we examine people. So what's missing from the Western worldview? The idea is that everything is sacred. Everything. All people. We are part of the land. We're walking land, as we like to say. And we're all sacred, not just human beings, but every part of creation. In a Western Enlightenment-bound worldview, human beings are categorized apart from creation. The results of false dichotomy between the physical earth, or our bodies, and the ethereal, or the mind and the spirit. Theologically, this is a bad material world with potentially good spiritual people who are just aliens and visitors. And that is bad theology. An indigenous worldview, and I would also argue that in a pre-Enlightenment Middle Eastern worldview, all creation is understood as physical and fully spiritual. Healing, then, must consider the healing of people, the healing of our history, like colonialism and neocolonialism, and the healing of all creation. So I noticed Jesus said stuff like, don't say by heaven because heaven's God's throne, and don't say by earth because earth's God's footstool. He understood everything to be sacred, which is a normal worldview. So how do we see the other as ourselves? Racism, I would argue, even though, we watch the news and we watch what happens when another black man gets shot or those kinds of things. But racism is most often expressed by simply allowing unjust systems to remain unchallenged and to become indifferent to the injustice resulting from those unchallenged systems. That's called the privilege of indifference. Injustice is deadly for some and not others. So solidarity has to be actionable. It was interesting to watch what happened in Luke 4, the story when Jesus goes in his hometown. And he reads this from Isaiah 61, and we all know it's from Isaiah 61. There's one thing that Jesus leaves out, and that is why he's doing all this. I guess he wanted them to figure it out. Why is God empowering me, inspiriting me to bring good news to the poor? To proclaim captives will be released. This is all speaking of the Jubilee Sabbath Shalom system, where you leave a portion of your land, 1/7 of it, in fact, to people who where the food grows wild and they can go harvest it, to wild animals. You every 7th year you leave all of your land, all 7 portions out for them. You don't glean the edges of your field because poor people need it, because animals need it. You don't go back for a barrel of grapes, or you don't go back for a cart of wheat. Leave them out there because why? And then all these things are named, the poor, the wild ass and ox, etc. All of them need. So in other words, the idea is to take care of all of creation with these safety nets, right? This is the point. Jesus is saying, this is why I've come, is to fulfill Jubilee in a real way. So what we've done in the Western world is kind of taken that and we've theologized it to say, well, if I have Jesus, I have Jubilee. And that's a very nice individual gift. Only, unfortunately, it's not at all what Jesus meant. Jesus meant for this to be corporal, to be in our communities, to be structured. In fact, shalom can sometimes be called structured love. It's how we take care of each other in case someone doesn't get taken care of. And so he confronts them because what they understand it as is something different. They understand it as something just for them, just like we've theologized it today. And so he begins to tell them these stories, right? And one is the story of the Syrophoenician lady, and how Elijah went to her, and there's a lot of widows who were hungry in Israel during that famine, but God went to her outside. And then he told about Naaman, the Syrian, who Elisha went to and told him to dip 7 times in the Jordan and he would be healed. And they didn't like that either, mostly because Jesus was saying, this is not just for us. This is for everyone. It's for everyone. It's for everyone you look down on. Oh my goodness. Naaman was a centurion of the oppressing army that occupied Israel at the time. Who could you hate more, right? And yet Jesus is saying to his own people, and if he's not afraid to say it to his own people, he's certainly not afraid to say it to us. We have to take care of those, even those we despise most. We have to listen to them and we have to care for them. And that is the mission of Christ. So we have to ask ourselves now some good questions, right? Things like, what is Jesus saying to the American churches or to the Friends churches about the other, about the dignity of the other, about the stolen land on which we live? What is Jesus saying to us about the stolen land on which we live? About the disenfranchised and the disinherited, and about how we think about our corrupted Western worldview that has caused us to think of people as less than what God intended. And then what does Jesus intend for us to do personally and structurally in 2021? Like Matt read from Caitlin's book, what's next? So I guess that's the question. I told Matt asked me for some questions, and I said, I wanted you to come up with your own questions, but the one question I'll leave really is what's next, because that's the most important one. So thanks a lot for taking this journey from my perspective with me.